back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow, and I always look forward to talking to our next guest. I hope you enjoy the conversation too. Harvey J. Kaye is a professor emeritus at the University of Wisconsin in Green Bay. He is the author of a number of books, the latest of which is FDR on Democracy. Many years ago, he wrote Thomas Paine and The Promise of America. He's also written about the fight for the four freedoms. He is a professor of history and sociology by background, and he joins us now. So first of all, Harvey J. Kaye, thanks for coming back on the program.
I'll come back anytime you ask. It's a pleasure.
I'm going to take you up on that because I always enjoy these conversations. And we are now partway in, almost done with the first quarter, the first 3 months of the Biden presidency. As you and I have already discussed, Biden at various times alluded to wanting to be a president on the scale of FDR, a transformative president, not a caretaker presidency, but a transformative one. So let's start with this, if you don't mind. Obviously, it's very early. The first 100 days is always considered historically significant. How's he doing?
Well, let's put it this way. He's, as everyone knows, he's far better than Trump.
Right.
As for a start, okay? And he seems to be on the path to surpassing his president to whom he was vice president, Barack Obama. However, the word transformational that you use is really critical here, because it may well be that he's going to do some significant things. Okay, I think the American Rescue Plan was significant, but we shouldn't forget that it's temporary, much of what's in there. In fact, I don't know if anything is beyond temporary in there. And then, having announced this week the American Jobs Plan, it looked, until I looked more closely, it looked like he actually might become, or at least start to become, transformational, but that's not the case. Okay, it's not the case. For a start, I think the $2 trillion.
Right.
It doesn't come off my tongue very easily, but the $2 trillion, in spite of the difficulty of saying it, is not exactly what I expected to hear in the jobs plan. So, for example, Joe Manchin himself, a few times in the last couple of months, or 3 months, has actually referred to a $4 trillion recovery plan.
Right.
Okay. Progressive groups have envisioned anything from an $8 to $11 trillion recovery plan. And the other thing is, built into the recovery plan are elements that people are welcoming, but might actually be better off not really considered, if you like, an infrastructure program. But now, having said all of that, I think even more fundamental to the question of transformational is that, is he prepared to go to fight for whatever it takes? Is he prepared to fight to go for the PRO Act and the We the People Act? Those are, to me, those are fundamental. And to do that, might well have to first line up with, all the forces he can muster to get rid of the filibuster, which he has yet to acknowledge he would do. He said that he foresaw the possibility of returning the filibuster to its original, if you like, fashion, its original operation.
Where you had to talk.
Is that was the filibuster that blocked civil rights and blocked all the other good stuff for who knows how many decades, you might say. That's first. But then the other thing is that he did then say, well, if we can't do that, then he might be willing to consider. The point is, you're going to talk FDR or you're going to talk LBJ even. You've got to talk about transformation regarding changing the structure, changing, if you like, the relationship, I'll go right to the point, between labor and capital, and not just between, and also the question of voting right. Those two are essential. Because if you think about FDR in the 30s, it's changing the relationships between labor and capital. If you think of Johnson, and of course, the civil rights movement of Martin Luther King in the 60s, we're talking civil rights and even more significantly in some ways in 65, voting rights. Because Thomas Paine once said, the right to vote is the right that protects all the other rights.
Right.
So that's the question that seems to surround the moment.
Well, it's an interesting, fascinating way to look at it, Harvey Kaye, because it's basically, I'm trying to think of a good analogy for it, but what you're basically saying, PRO Act obviously does a great deal, not everything I would like to do, but a great deal to restore organizing rights to the workplace. The For the People Act doesn't do everything I would like to do, but we know I'm a radical, and does a lot to restore democratic rights, voting rights. And what you're basically saying is that these two, if I understand you correctly, is that these two are the truly transformational proposals on the table right now, which is not to dismiss the critical nature of giving people jobs or interim income or some measure of relief on the healthcare front, but basically these are the rights that are these are the rights of organization and voting that from which all others follow.
Yeah, the For the People Act actually would be more transformational than it may at first appear, because in a fashion it goes beyond voting rights, because what it's also going to do, that and the PRO Act together, will open up the South in a way that neither FDR could sustain. Okay, in other words, the National Labor Relations Act of 35 was essentially in 47 greatly undone, at least regarding the South, by the Taft-Hartley Act.
Right.
That really licensed, bad word perhaps, but licensed right-to-work states.
Right.
And we the people is, it's pretty crucial, I think. By the way, and I said the South, let me also add that Wisconsin, which was, not a right-to-work state, and indeed was the first state back in 59 to grant collective union organizing and collective bargaining rights to public employees. Well, Scott Walker in 2011 and his Republican legislature, these utterly reactionary folks who occupied the seats in the legislature then and continue to do so, they stripped public employees, I am a public employee, of our collective bargaining rights, and then went on and within a couple of years, or 3 years, I'm forgetting the exact number, and turned us into a full-scale right-to-work state. So the PRO Act would be really significant in essence, in disabling right to work, or enabling real right to work. Right
to organize. The and what intrigues me about that, Harvey J. Kaye, is the support that we've seen in recent years for labor organizing from rural states, southern states, Midwestern states. I'm thinking primarily of the teacher strikes that got so much support in West Virginia and Oklahoma and Arizona and elsewhere. I'm thinking of there are apparently some new coal miner strikes about now underway in Alabama. And if I recall correctly, labor unions in general are still pretty popular with the voting public across the country. So these could presumably engender one kind of shift. And then, of course, voting rights. I was very pleased. We recorded on Thursdays. I was very pleased to see Biden come out strongly, as strongly, I think, as he felt he could be, supportive of the athletes in Georgia, raising the possibility of boycotts of that state over the new repressive law. So the combination of giving voting rights to the disenfranchised, the strategically disenfranchised, and organization could not only change the country, but presumably, I want to know what you think, presumably could lift the fortunes of the Democratic Party a little bit.
Well, not just lift, but let's put it this way. I feel like we're on what is a tipping point? It's like we can go one way or we can go the other way.
Right.
One of the ways is that, in fact, Republicans prevail in state after state after state in stripping people of the capacity. They can't strip them of the right, but they can strip them of the capacity to vote. I mean,
Right.
a simple thing to do is, which was part of the Georgia plan, I think, but it may well be the case in many another state, is the fact that they could literally reduce, the place you go to vote to maybe one place in a whole county, which we've seen already.
Right.
Okay. And then the other thing is, and Wisconsin, we are literally suffering it more than I think the majority of states where Republicans rule, a reapportionment that took place based on the 2010 census. They constructed it to guarantee Republican hold on the legislature for years, and really it is the case nationally. There are, even though parties have been in decline for years, there are more Democrats and Republicans, but it's hard enough to try to compete with the U.S. Senate already being occupied by Republicans who come from states that are going to be Republican forever, no matter what we do. It seems like Wyoming and so on. But then to have states like Wisconsin, where they've apportioned in such a way so that we'll end up sending, House members completely out of proportion to the capital D Democratic base in Wisconsin. I mean, there's all those things to consider. It really is that kind of thing. And with regard to labor, if in fact the Democrats and the Biden administration don't figure out a way truly of empowering workers, okay, they've already at least temporarily abandoned the fight for 15. Okay, Schumer says they're going to come back with it. We could come back to that in a little while. A lot of working people, and I don't just mean white working people, I mean Latino and African American and others, are going to see the Democratic Party as literally incapable of doing anything on behalf of working people who haven't seen wages in decades relative to the cost of living. So if they don't do that, 2022 could be unpleasant and 2024 could be a nightmare. And so now I come back to the other thing. If we don't re-legislate the relationship between labor and capital, well, the Republicans were probably poised, as I'm sure we're probably poised to turn the entire country into one vast right to work, state. As happened with I'm forgetting the case that came up before, where literally it lifted public employees unions from securing the dues for political ends, that kind of thing. I forget the case. I apologize.
Well, I think, in listening to all of this, I agree with you in your analysis, and I would add to that, I also agree with you, a great concern about 2022, and we're 1/8 of the way toward that election already, as hard as it is to believe. So, the clock is ticking. It's both early and late in terms of politics. I will say this, having said, I want much more fundamental change than I would expect from any Democratic president. I do think Biden's done a couple things right, and then I'll say what I think is missing, and I'll be curious of your thoughts. I think that rather than retract his statements that he was going to work with with Republicans and compromise with Republicans, which is patently absurd given the way Republicans on the Hill behave, I think instead of retracting that statement, he did something clever, which is he said, I'm going to do things that Republican voters want. It's a little bit of a sleight of hand, but if you look at the polling, Republican voters are pretty supportive of unions. They're very supportive of jobs programs. They're supportive of protecting Social Security and in some polls expanding it, and so on. So if you go down the line, he's kind of said, yes, I'm reaching across the aisle to the voter. He's doing a little switch. And I think that's smart. I also think he's been, bolder than I expected. I mean, made no secret of the fact that I supported Bernie in the primaries, but bolder than I expected. But what I'm missing and what I'm really interested in your thoughts about, although you can say whatever you want to say, I'll be interested, but is I don't hear a unifying theme. Build Back Better is not the New Deal, right? Build Back Better is kind of like a general contractor's, agreement or something. It's not bad. I'm not against it, but I don't see or hear the vision of the country. If you want to be FDR, if you want to be transformational, I don't see the transformational hook or theme.
Yes, you know what? On that, we absolutely agree. And I'll start off with a very practical side of that. And that is, I don't know who his advisors are. I'm sure they're more adept at politics than I am since I'm a historian, not a politician. But it strikes me that the way in which you usually go about advancing your agenda, and I would like to believe that they were capable of rendering some kind of vision for people to imagine the future in, is you don't first go on a trip to try to promote what you're doing. You go before a joint session of Congress, especially since, before a joint session of Congress, and you lay out your agenda in terms of a vision. And I think Build Back Better will excite very few people. Okay? Because it sounds like, well, yeah, we'll repair the roads, we'll do this, and that, and so on and so forth. But that concerns me a lot. In fact, I don't know if it was the last time we spoke. I think we even talked about the possibility of talking almost immediately after his first joint session to address to Congress. I have this vague idea that
I think so. Yeah.
And we are some weeks later, and we don't have that yet. Now, some people say, "Oh, not another speech to Congress and all that." No, but seriously speaking, the only way you're going to get people's attention is you do a speech to a joint session of Congress. He did his press conference yesterday, or his remarks yesterday.
Right.
It was during the day. Most people, if they're going to bother to turn on the TV during the day, they're probably going to watch a show they really didn't want to miss, or they're going to catch up on the case in the Twin Cities. Right. I mean, that's okay. So I don't know who even heard what he had to say for a start. So I thought, well, where are we going? Where are we going in all of this? Plus, and this is what I want to then bring us back also to FDR, is FDR, people don't realize just how many signals he sent to his fellow citizens that he wanted to be pushed. He wanted to be pushed. He invited, when he said his fellow Americans should write to him, they took that seriously. He had more letters. He was getting hundreds of thousands of letters, and they had a staff of people opening these letters. And then out of certain letters, they would choose the ones that FDR needed to hear, not ones that would stroke his ego. Okay. So, and then also, for example, by the way, in FDR's first 100 days, and I listen to people on podcasts, radio, and otherwise, I don't think they know FDR, honestly. I don't mean to brag about what I know, but they don't know FDR. They'll skip over the fact that in the first 100 days in the National Industrial Recovery Act, okay, he wasn't just ready to advance the recovery. He actually built in, with Senator Wagner's encouragement, a stipulation in 33 of the right of workers to organize and bargain collectively. It turned out later that it was ineffective because companies learned how to get around it. But it was also the case that by doing that, millions of workers sought entry into the labor movement by way of organizing unions. The AFL in 1933 did not even know how to handle all of that. One person said, "This is so wild. This is like the Magna Carta of labor." And this was in 33, not in 35. And by the way, if people look closely, there were massive strikes in 1934. Why? Because workers felt empowered by their president's words to press, to push, to demand recognition of their rights as unionists. There were even general strikes in certain cities. Now, FDR himself, you get this idea as you look at this from start to finish that no, himself was not a labor leader, okay, but he understood the imperative of rallying people, not simply to his own agenda, but rallying them to empower themselves in their confrontations with industrial capital. And by the way, people say, wasn't he a rich guy? Roosevelt came from old money.
Right.
pre-industrial money. Okay.
Right.
So he had a different understanding of what those capitalists were about, you might say. Okay.
Yeah,
So,
that's so interesting. And again, we're talking with Harvey J. Kaye about Biden and FDR. When he said of the bankers, "I welcome their hatred."
right,
He was talking about Arrivistas or whatever, Nouveau Riche.
right. Yeah, I welcome the hatred, he said. You're absolutely right.
I can't imagine that coming from Biden, but but I do think that, excuse me, but I do think that there's this missing element of a unifying theory behind.
Oh yeah,
Biden's
no, sure,
presidency.
yes.
And I mentioned the New Deal. You mentioned his exhortations to labor and his calls to organize, and his there's also, his vision of Social Security. We've talked about the Townsend clubs and the other movements that were calling for something like that, but viewing it as a kind of cradle to grave form of financial security. That's a social vision for the country. It's enormous, and of course, then
Yes.
the four freedoms.
Right.
And maybe I'm being a little unfair to Joe Biden, bringing up these comparisons so early, but I have a feeling Roosevelt talked about these things right out of the chute when he became
He was
president.
talking about those things on the campaign trail. I mean, again, a lot of people I don't expect the people to go back and read all his speeches. I have every one of FDR's speeches at hand right here. And the book that I just did, FDR and Democracy, I even left out the banking bill because it didn't address democracy in particular, because there are so many other speeches in which he speaks of democracy, but he does so even to the point of he calls for the redistribution of wealth. I mean, publicly. Redistribution of wealth. How would you like to hear Joe Biden talk about that? Well, here's another thing. Part of the problem may be is that the liberal tongues, the liberal pundits, the liberal writers they're literally, I'll say it, they're having orgasms over what's taking place in the Biden administration.
Right.
They're talking about him as the second coming of FDR before he's even gone truly in the direction of FDR. And I find it not just annoying, but it's not going to help any of us if it feeds Biden's ego or Ron Klain's ego to hear those kinds of things. One of the things that unified FDR's entire presidency is that in 1932, he called for an economic declaration of rights for working people.
Right.
In 1941, he called for the four freedoms, which had a more universal kind of projection. And then in 1944, he called once again for an economic bill of rights. And he did all of that based on, one, the fact that his entire New Deal years were predicated on pushing the freedom from want and freedom from fear. And then the other thing is that he knew that Americans wanted it. He had literally led them to understand just how determined they could be in pursuing them. So in 1943, he actually commissioned secret polls from the White House with the major opinion. It wasn't a private company. It was operated out of Princeton, New Jersey, Princeton University. It was a massive polling operation. And they were asking Americans, what do you want beyond the war? And he knew going into the 44 election year what they wanted. They wanted not just the New Deal to be revived. They wanted national health care. Mm-hmm. They wanted education and higher education for all, as far as people could take themselves, meaning to what extent they were capable of doing that.
Right.
Could you imagine 85% of Americans in 1943-44 wanted national health care? And that was like 95% of Democrats and 75% of Republicans. I mean, so there was a unifying vision, economic security, and even those who had been left out in this sense, that African Americans heard those things, and instead of getting cynical, they heard themselves inside of that vision. Mm-hmm. And so as a consequence, civil rights activism really began to take off in the 30s, took off all the more during World War II, and FDR himself appointed a court which was far more sympathetic to questions of civil rights. I could go on and on. let's come back to Biden. What could Biden do? Well, for a start, everybody got so excited that Biden said workers have the right to organize. Well, that's a law. All he's doing is telling us, yeah, there's a law. Instead of saying something that we don't know if FDR said the exact words, but labor put out posters. I have it somewhere here on my wall, a postcard of it. It said, if I worked in a factory, I'd join a union. That's okay.
Right.
And whether he exactly said it or not, he never told the AFL to take the posters down. Okay. And then, so imagine if Biden had said, if I worked in a warehouse, I'd be sure to join a union. One extra sentence.
Right. So, well, Harvey, this is all so interesting to me. But one of the things it brings up for me is the relationship of the rest of the left today to where Biden is in this moment and where he isn't. One of my perennial concerns is the tendency of people on the particularly Democratic Party left to declare victory much too soon. And to me, I feel even from the squad or whomever that there's just a lot of, well, Joe Biden is doing great, as opposed, and part of that is probably post-traumatic from the Trump years and so on. But to me, the other piece of it is, good start, Mr. President, but we need you to say this. And I'm just wondering how you grade the Democratic Party left.
Okay, of course, there's the Democratic Party left and there's the left. Okay.
Right, of course.
But, I'm going to say one thing which relates to that, and then I'll hope to answer your question. You may have noted that about a week ago, it came out, Axios and some other places reported, that Biden had done what Obama did when he first came into office. He invited a cohort of historians to meet with him.
I saw that, yes.
Now, I can tell you, I wrote about this not immediately after Obama had his meeting originally back in 2009, or maybe it was late 2008. But the fact is, when Obama invited historians to the White House, he brought in the folks who show up on CNN, who would have had nothing good to say, but, like the standard presidential historians stuff. And by the way, presidential historians can be fun to read, but I'll be honest, no real historian learns anything from presidential historians.
Right.
And I said it.
I believe you. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure you do. Okay. I have nothing against Doris Kearns Goodwin, though she did plagiarize once. I have nothing against Michael Beschloss. He may not even live too far away from you. But the point is that they're not the ones you should be talking to. And I laid out who I thought he should be talking to. It included historians, diverse in background, who knew about, and not necessarily, were fanatically in love with FDR or Lincoln for that matter. But what they knew is that if you want to be transformational, you can have the best intentions, but you have to mobilize people, not just to vote for you, but to literally help push you.
Right.
Eric Foner and folks like that, Eric Foner, Columbia University, and others.
Sure. Yeah.
So now I looked last week at the historians that Biden brought in, and those were assembled by another presidential historian, John Meacham.
Right. Okay.
Now, the group he brought in was, I can tell you, superior intellectually to the group that Obama brought in. Okay. Although Doris Kearns Goodwin and Michael Beschloss might have been in both groups, but they brought in a more diverse group of historians, but they were not the kinds of historians that, once again, Biden needed. Okay. And, to me, I thought, by the way, people don't get the idea that I expected them to invite me. I did not expect them to invite me. My politics of the left may not have been welcome in the White House, no matter how much I want Biden to succeed. Okay. But there are other folks from Ivy League schools who could have shown up, perhaps. Okay.
All right. The ones that could pass the elitist muster.
Right. Yeah. Harvard, Yale, you name the crew.
Right.
Well, my point is that they need to hear the kinds of things I was just telling you. And I don't expect Biden to be a radical. I don't expect Ron Klain to go radical. But indeed, if you're going to do this kind of thing, then make it truly educational. Okay. And I'm not saying that they didn't tell him important things, because what I heard was they told him to go big and go fast. But don't go just big and fast. Go populist. Go small d Democratic. Engage your fellow citizens. Don't just recruit them to work in jobs, recruit them to join the union. And by the way, now I'll come back to something else. And that is that in his talk yesterday, and he said this kind of thing before, that he basically said, look, we're up against China. To make the shorthand is, we're up against China. Okay. It's like this, like it's not quite a Cold War, but it's a Cold War.
It's getting there.
But what he said is, and this is the telling thing, he said, we have to prove and show the world that democracy can do the kinds of things that people have been doubting. Okay. And that's what this jobs plan is about, and other things. Well, if he's so committed to the question of democracy with a small d, well, then don't worry about what the hell China's doing right away. And don't talk to Americans about China, right? Talk to them about how to make America more democratic, small d democratic. To go back again, the voting rights. Industrial democracy which is what they used to call it in the 30s, right to organize and bargain collectively. Those are the kinds of things. Guarantee people that they can walk in the streets safely, whether they're white or black, okay, without worrying about either the typical street crime or the also all too typical of late men in blue crime, right?
Right.
I mean, those are the kinds of things, talk to them about how to make America. By the way, sorry, I know I'm hogging the mic here, but
that's okay. That's why you're here.
There are four, think about the New Deal. There are four dimensions. There was relief, which we saw now in the rescue plan. And then we've got reconstruction, reform, and recovery. And some people have said to me, well, wait, you mean to say recovery comes last? And I said, I'll tell you why. Because whenever we've confronted major crises, the way that we've pursued the strengthening of the nation is by pursuing reconstruction and reform, not placing recovery up front. Okay. So,
yeah, I mean, that's a great observation. Yeah. And to me, and maybe we'll close with this, that you wear two hats academically, historian and sociologist. And to me, the sociological dimension of this gets overlooked. My problem with presidential historians, some of whom I'm sure lovely people and good writers and everything else, is the fixation on the executive as opposed to A, the rest of government going all the way down, but B, as opposed to the population as a whole. If you see government and the process of being governed as a kind of dialogue between a citizenry and their elected officials, it's a one-sided conversation if you're just talking to government historians, much less presidential historians. And then it becomes about, John and Abigail Adams like to have hot chocolate at 9 p.m. or whatever every night before retiring to bed. And I'm being a little flippant, but not enough about, you remember better than I do, the whole movement towards telling everyday people's history. But to me, the conversation people should be having, including people like us on the air or Biden and academics, should be, should the government and the population energize and guide each other more effectively going forward? I mean, that's my closing thought, but I'll turn it over to you.
Well, one thing the president has is an advantage for the last few decades, and that is because the people's voices, which are expressed through civil society as much as they are through elections, have been muffled all these years, right? Because the civil society itself is so weakened. Okay. I mean, we think that turning out in the streets is the best way to express voices. Turning out in the streets is supposed to come after all the other things have failed you.
Right.
Right. And labor, when's the last time you heard labor effectively push anything? Well, it's not labor's fault alone, though I think the labor leadership has become timid, except for our friend Sarah Nelson. And before that, maybe Leo Gerard and a few others. But the fact is that you've got to have a strong labor movement to advance the cause of workers. Period. Okay. You have to have strong civil rights organizations to advance the questions of people of color. I mean, it's these kinds of things. And we've seen I was counting again. I remember when I first used to say 30 years of class war. Then it became 40 years of class war. Today I was doing a count and I said, when do I start saying it's been 50 years of class war from above? I mean, and if I go back to the Lewis Powell memorandum, it's 50 years.
Right. You're absolutely right. And, you need one of those things like bus drivers have, 349 days without an accident, but it's like 50.5 years of class war. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, but hopefully we, the people, are going to figure out how to fight our side of this class war too going forward. But it's going to be interesting to watch this government over the next few months, nail biting and interesting. So Harvey J. Kaye, historian and sociologist and author. As always, there are a million other things I could talk to you about, but we're out of time. So as always, great talking with you. And
thank you, Richard. I always enjoy our conversations. Thank you.
Me too. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.